Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Professor Gunnar Babcock, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Yeah, I started finding your work and your ideas through Michael Levin. I had him on the show. I've had a lot of really interesting guests in the last year, scientists, philosophers, people that are trying to seek to understand the nature of consciousness. I had Carl Friston on, John Joe McFadden, all these folks. And it's funny because all of them agree about a few things, but disagree about so many things. And that's the beauty of the journey of seeking to understand consciousness. And so when I discovered your work, I thought it would be interesting to get you on and maybe describe a little bit about how you became so interested in philosophy and in biology. And you seem to really focus on the nature of cognition, but not from the same vantage point as most folks. So,
yeah, no. I started my interest in all of this kind of really coming from a philosophical perspective. I actually started out in ancient philosophy, and then for a whole variety of reasons, that ended up leading me kind of into a lot more of the biology. And then slowly but surely, I've kind of continued to just trend further and further into the weeds of the philosophy and biology of kind of modern, neuroscience and whatnot. So that's where I spend a lot of my time. But really, I come at everything primarily from, evolutionary perspective, which is probably a little bit of a different spin than a lot of the other folks that you named just now.
Yeah, I'd love to learn a little bit about how you got to the place of thinking about the split body problem. I was reading some of your work there, and how you think of non-living systems having goal orientation, if you will, or having some form of agency even.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that unfortunately, both because of the history around teleology, goal-directedness, and function, there tends to be a lot of, historically, just kind of since the modern period, teleology was really seen as the enemy of mechanistic thinking, or mechanistic explanations, mechanistic thought. So they've kind of, from a historical vantage point, been contrasted to one another or seen kind of as at odds. And I think that's largely contributed to when you had a kind of a revival, a move away from mechanistic thinking, there's been a return to teleology and goal-directedness. And the paradigmatic examples of that tend to be life. And so when people have moved away from mechanistic explanations to understand life, there's been a propensity to kind of then jump back and think that teleology or goal-directedness must be the key or the answer, because that's what's set at odds or kind of in opposition to mechanistic thinking. For me, I just don't see them as being fundamentally at odds at all. So I actually tend to think that mechanistic modes of explanation are not contrary or in any sort of contradiction or tension with teleological explanation. So I actually think that kind of dichotomy was just broken from the beginning. So when people tend to look to teleological modes of explanation to explain life, I just think there's nothing unique about life that necessarily precludes it from being captured by mechanistic or kind of a Newtonian mechanics or whatever you would find in kind of normal physics explanation. We don't have all of it yet, clearly, but they're just not in tension in the way that a lot of people, I think, tend to see them as being in tension.
Right. And it seems like you always describe things like there's a field or there's this hierarchical element to it. And you've even described a lot about microbes. And I've been listening to you speak about that. And I'd love the audience, if they've never heard your ideas, hear about how you describe so many different types of systems that are not necessarily conscious in the way that we would think of them being conscious, but they have some form of agency. And it is seeming to come from some intelligent air? I don't know how it works. Is it a morphic field? What is the field?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And here, this is where I find myself in a tremendous amount of agreement with people like Mike Levin on kind of having a much more inclusive or expanding kind of notion of biological agency. I think he's really hitting the nail on the head with a lot of this. I mean, the first consideration kind of, and my interest in microbiology and kind of the microbial world really comes from just recognizing that actually when it comes to life, I mean, we're predisposed, of course, to be really anthropocentric and, focus on us and stuff like us when we look for consciousness. But I think even more importantly, what's often even more neglected is just the fact that when you're talking about life more generally, I mean, it's really microbes. I mean, it's unicellular stuff, which is not all microbes, but I mean, the unicellular world. I mean, that's what life is, at least as far as we've encountered life here. And then there's the very, very exceptionally rare and very, very peculiar looking, multicellular, big sexually reproducing thing that even begins to remotely resemble something like us. So just to rattle off some facts around that, I mean, I think there are literally trillions of species of microbes. We haven't even begun to get anywhere near taxonomizing all of them. I mean, that's just our best guess. And that's species, I mean, a trillion species. And then if you did something like you compared the biomass, I think if just you weighed all the life on the planet, I think in the oceans, about 90% of the biomass is microbes. On land, wow. It's more like 50-50. And then you kind of consider stuff like that, and really, life is microbial. I mean, it's unicellular, it's asexual, and then there are these weird offshoots on the tree of life that are more like us.
So I don't remember where we were at, but now that I have you back, we got cut off there. But I think where it led me to was to wonder, what is agency? And when you start to think about quantum mechanics, I've been listening to people speak about how quantum mechanics and biology are these interdisciplinary fields are starting to talk to each other and realize how important it is to cross-pollinate and to examine each other's work, because the field, if we want to call it that, or the stuff that we can't really pin down, is a big part of what's driving this mechanical world, if we want to call it that, or the biological world. We can't separate the biology from the sun, per se. So what is your thoughts on agency and how much it has to do with the quantum mechanical world or the physics?
Yeah, so here I take a relatively standard, let me rephrase. I take a standard philosophical position. So I'm a thoroughgoing compatibilist in this realm, kind of in the sense of somebody like Dan Dennett, the late Dan Dennett, so arguments that try to incorporate the possibility of quantum indeterminacy as a way of grounding something like consciousness and explaining free will or agency, I tend to think that there are a number of problems with that. So while I'm open to the possibility that there are aspects of neurology and of our brains that are sensitive to quantum difference makers, it seems to me that there's no reason, we don't need to go there to actually explain consciousness and goal-directedness, that actually all of it can be adequately, not only adequately, but is actually probably correctly explained by normal deterministic causes. And here is where, for anybody that I think is familiar with the free will debate as it's unfolded in philosophy, kind of is familiar with a lot of compatibilist positions. So generally, the position that, and I mean, there's a lot of nuance in here, but very generally sketched, the kind of compatibilist position that I hold is that indeterminacy doesn't get you free will or goal-directedness if I was indeterministic, and the choices that I made, whether I have coffee or tea, was merely a matter of indeterministic quantum chance, then I'm not freely choosing anything. Then all I'm doing is rolling dice, and which one I end up having, the coffee or the tea, is not up to me in any meaningful sense. That's not free will. I'm not choosing anything in that case. In fact, what it is to choose things is to determine them. So in a deterministic world, as long as I'm the agent, as long as parts internal to me are responsible for the determination, then I'm acting with agency. But all of that is perfectly compatible with a deterministic kind of view in physics or what have you. So, yeah, I mean, you might say something to the effect of, if I'm riding a bus and the bus turns and I'm pushed over, okay, outside forces determined that I was going to be pushed over, but I didn't choose that. And the reason I didn't choose it and it wasn't freely chosen by me is because the bus is external to me. It's not a part of me. Therefore, what determined that I did that was not me. Whereas when I say something like my psychology and my propensity for, caffeine and my physiology is what led me to choose the coffee over the tea, then the things that made that determination are actually parts internal to me, parts of my neurology, my physiology. Then I'm responsible and I'm what's determining those. So even though both are, it's determined in the same way that, the bus is determining where I fall when it takes the turn. In the one case, I'm exhibiting free will or agency, and in the other case, I'm not. So that's the view that I take. Where I've kind of advocated, and maybe what I've added to this debate, is really seeing teleology or goal-directedness as being explained by that compatibilist view, where typically those aren't connected in the literature. Usually the free will debate and the goal-directedness agency debate aren't seen as overlapping a lot. So that also adds into where I see kind of, I'm okay with, say, attributing agency to a microbe, where I really say, okay, microbes act in incredibly deterministic ways. You really can, not give a full explanation of how a microbe is going to explain when you put it in a sugar gradient or something like that. But by and large, you can pretty accurately predict what a given microbe is going to do in a particular gradient. And to me, well, if the mechanisms that are guiding the microbe to take a particular goal-directed trajectory, that is like towards a food source, then if they're internal to the microbe, then it's acting with some degree of agency. Is that agency as complex and as interesting as the agency that you or I have? Well, no. It's much more minimal than that, but it has some degree of agency in a way that, say, a rock has almost none.
Yeah, so what does this mean on the practical level when it comes to creating the synthetic biology like the Xenobot or the Anthrobot that Michael's doing, and then using AI systems and thinking about AI in the future being biologically based and us being the ones that are driving the algorithms and making the prompts? What does this mean in regards to that?
So I think this is where, I really like Mike's stuff, and I really, it's just so fascinating. And I can't even begin to understand so much of what he's discovering with all of this. But I definitely think Mike's on the right path insofar as attributing agency in this kind of graded way all the way down to stuff like that, because I think he is absolutely right that what is interesting, even in the most minimum algorithms, minimal line of code, it's able to do interesting things that are not necessarily predictive or what we programmed into it. So he's observed that and done empirical studies that verify as much. So I think he's absolutely right in attributing agency into something like a Xenobot. From my perspective, though, I suppose I don't see that. So I'm in wholehearted agreement, but I also don't see it as being fundamentally different than, say, what humans have been doing for, the last 8,000-ish years in domesticated breeding programs. When we, and again, this goes back to the origin of the species. The beginning of how Darwin kind of convinces everybody that natural selection as a thing is he draws a comparison with artificial selection and breeding pigeons, right? So to me, the fact that we, that is humans, are artifactually going in and tailoring things, or can kind of edit things through a whole host of, means in synthetic biology, fundamentally, conceptually, it is no different than I think what we've been doing for forever with selective breeding and domestication. I mean, it's just obviously allows for much, a lot more, obviously, than what we've ever been capable of with domestication.
Yeah, and it changes our identification from me or the ego or the I to we. And I heard Josh Bongard really reinforcing that the other day, and it makes sense because you start to just think of us as a system that's this living happening. It's an unfolding, and we're all sort of orienting towards something. But then doesn't it make you immediately think that if we're creating things in petri dishes like this and programming in some sort of agency, if we will, or free will, what is higher than us that we can't even imagine that would be possibly part of making us the way that we are, if anything? Not saying there is, but it sure makes us beg the question. Are we programs of a larger, more intelligent system that's maybe doing this to some degree? Or how do you think about that?
Well, so I don't think there's any need to posit intentionality or agency in anything like that. So, I guess where I would start in pushing back on a view like that would be something like saying, I think an unedited E. coli bacterium exhibits just as much agency as, say, a xenobot or something that we have tinkered with in whatever way. So the E. coli bacterium is just the result, or let's say for the purposes of the argument here, let's just say it's perfectly the result of just natural selective processes, and it would act and behave exactly as it does if there were no humans or nothing with what we would tend to call intelligent life. It would to me, it would be just as agential as as a xenobot or whatever else. I think what Mike has interestingly shown is how far down that agency goes, and that you really can find it even in things that we're trying to make as deterministic or run very precisely according to what we would like them to do, that it's actually really hard to pull that off. And even in the simplest little line of code, it kind of does some really surprising things that you wouldn't actually anticipate it would be capable of doing. So I think those, sometimes those are called like affordances in the literature. So the interesting thing about those affordances, there is a lot to say there, in the way that you might think a rock doesn't have affordances like that. But I don't think that you need a mechanism more powerful than, say, natural selection to elicit that. And I think it's quite easy to imagine how we are products of natural selection in a very similar sense, and that the agency that we exhibit and we have has resulted from kind of processes of selection churning over long.
So when someone asks you what is life, you basically come to the conclusion that it's an unfolding form of goal-directedness through the evolutionary process of natural selection throughout the whole cosmos, maybe even?
Oh God, no, I'm not that.
I know that's a weird question.
I back away. Yeah, so I tend to think it's very hard to define life. In fact, I wouldn't even attempt a definition. I would say some of the going candidates obviously can't be wrong or can't be right for various reasons. And one of the way that I've kind of argued and the stuff that I've done most powerfully is I think that merely observing goal-directed behavior and taking that to be a signature of life is probably wrong, because I think you can find goal-directed behavior in all sorts of non-living systems. So merely observing goal-directed behavior is insufficient for calling something life or being alive. It's not a signature of life. It does tend to crop up in really interesting and important ways in stuff that's living. But if there is a single feature of life, it's not that. And again, I'm dubious that there even is a single feature of life. In fact, if you really were to press me on this, I would say that the problem with life is it's a conceptual one. So I think that historically, for a whole variety of reasons, it's been really helpful to have this kind of binary category of life and non-life, non-living stuff. And where the current science is leading us is just that we actually need to expand our conceptual horizon here and just kind of give up on the life thing as being a meaningful category. That actually we need a lot more nuance and a lot more gradients. So I would actually kind of advocate for getting rid of that binary schema.
I see. The mind-body problem too is sort of it's non-existent when you do that. Then you start to eliminate that framework and you go zoom out even further, it seems, and you start to get beyond even that, because it seems that there's always the human component and that we are interpreting the universe through this filter, which is a limitation of its own. But I like that you do this. It's just hard to chomp on. And I'm wondering, at what point in your trajectory of curiosity did you get to these places where you see the world like this? Like, I'm sure in your 20s and even earlier than that, you had to work through a lot of these ideas, and then you start to build first principles thinking to some degree and try to get back to the minimal.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of intellectual trajectory that I think gets you to a place like this, I mean, my God, for me, it's just the classic Socratic dictum of, you realize your ignorance, right? You kind of come into something thinking you'll be able to understand it, and then the more you read and the more you figure stuff out, the more you realize you really don't know, and you kind of have to back away further and further and retreat to spots of what you might be able to say something true about. So yeah, I mean, in this particular case, what I would say as far as the conceptual revision that I've just suggested when it comes to life as being a meaningful category or a meaningful natural kind, for me, it really actually just kind of comes from learning the history of a lot of this stuff. So an example that I like to cite is that, throughout history, we tended to think that all of life or all of, living stuff was sexually reproducing. And then, we get microscopes, right? We start observing some microbes moving around, and we kind of make sense of what they were doing. You're like, oh my God, which one's the male? Which one's the female? How are they reproducing? What's going on? And then finally, we just had to do this conceptual revision. We went, well, shoot, they're just asexual. They just reproduce without doing the sex thing. Isn't that crazy, right? And then, boom, problem solved. All these advances being made. And then we figured out that actually, like, the majority of life reproduces that way. So what happened was there was a mismatch between empirically what we were discovering with the technology, in this case, microscopes, of the time, and the old conceptual categories that we had, the idea that everything was sexually reproducing. So the advance that needed to be made in that case was one of conceptual revision. It wasn't that we needed a new discovery or something else. It was just that the old conceptual frameworks just no longer fit with what we actually were learning about the world. So my position is, and again, I'm hedging my bets here, right? I mean, maybe something will come along that's going to prove me wrong, but when I hedge my bet in this case, I would say that the life, non-life category is going to turn out to be something kind of like that, where we're just going to need a much better conceptual framework. We're just going to need to say, hey, there are these gray areas, or there is this other category that we haven't even conceived of yet that actually can cash out a lot of the stuff that we are observing now, like xenobots and the stuff that we're seeing in synthetic biology and whatnot.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm curious where you go with that too. Like, who inspired you, like right now? Who's alive right now that's inspiring you in the field of developmental biology? Is Michael one of them,
Oh
or
my gosh, yeah. I mean, so much of Mike's stuff is utterly fascinating.
it's
But
crazy?
a lot of, for me, as I said, I kind of got my start in ancient philosophy. So a lot of the stuff that my familiarity really ends up going back to kind of weird, bizarre ways that the ancients used to think about stuff that, really, you can see how we got to where we are from some of that, but drawing those lines leads to a lot of inspiration and how you can kind of imagine really different concepts and different conceptual frameworks when you're thinking about stuff. But as far as other people that are doing interesting contemporary work, the other folks that kind of got me thinking about how goal-directedness is applicable to non-living systems and actually can possibly do a lot of explanatory work there are folks like Mike Wong and Robert Hazen, who
Hmm.
currently are doing a lot of really interesting stuff. So Mike Wong is an astrobiologist and Robert Hazen's a mineralogist. And they're just thinking about the evolution of minerals and kind of much larger cosmic systems and how we can think about those in various ways of, for me, that would denote something like goal-directedness or something like a directed system. For them, I think that they're asking really interesting questions about how we might identify or think about new laws of nature in those sorts of systems that have yet to be identified that can help do really interesting explanatory work when it comes to life and evolving systems. So I think that's
Hmm.
exactly the right sort of direction that we want to be going with these sorts of questions where um, they're asking, well, I mean, in a way, not exactly, but I think what they're asking is, so we can't define life, and one of the stumbling blocks that we have with something like that is that we know of certain laws of nature and kind of Newtonian mechanics and how the world of physics seems to work. We know a lot about that, but still doesn't seem to be able to capture a lot of the uniqueness that we see in some of the living stuff. So they're asking, okay, well, what other laws of nature might we have not observed yet that maybe are some of the laws of nature that are actually responsible for creating and governing some of this stuff? So they're kind of looking at it with a physics lens to try to explain this, saying maybe there are some conceptual resources that we haven't yet discovered that actually can
Hmm.
do that explanatory work. And I think that something like that is probably a really interesting, nice approach to answering some of these questions.
Awesome. I'll have to look those guys up. That sounds
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, they're
And
great.
then when you said you were studying ancient philosophy early on, were you also practicing like forms of meditation and things like that that were giving you introspective abilities? Because I've myself had my own weird subjective experiences. And then when you look back through history, even Einstein or people that come up with ideas, their best ideas or their best insights come from some of these states of consciousness. And I always find that to be really fascinating.
Yeah, no, no, I mean, so stuff kind of in like altered states of consciousness and transcendental experiences and like flow states and stuff like that, I think are all really interesting. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. And so, in various kind of non-academic aspects, areas of my life, I, I mean, introspectively, I see that and see them as being interesting and important. But from a kind of studying ancient philosophy viewpoint, no, I mean, really, what I found interesting about the ancients wasn't so much as looking at them as a model of necessarily how to go about like living my own life, but much more as a um, trying to understand where things are currently and having to do this really interesting backtracking. And then you kind of end up at where some of this thought originated, and you try to start wrapping your mind around that, and it leads to really interesting places. And then all of a sudden, you kind of at least for me, what happened was you really discover that a lot of the stuff that you find we grapple with today, it's been something that people have been grappling with for a long time, and a lot of the answers that you find in other places may not be right, but they're deeply, deeply interesting and deeply insightful for kind of understanding where we are today. So that was my interest, I think, in the
Cool.
ancients.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I like reading Zen koans and reading a lot of Eastern philosophy just because some of the languaging and insights are so, like you said, comparable to stuff we discover and use and think about here. But sometimes it just gives you different vantage points. And I would love to see that be more infused in the scientific community as we go. But I don't know if that's even possible, like more introspection and more of the awareness piece as the thing to be most curious about. Because as we create technological advancements and we're stepping on the gas pedal of this exponential growth, you can see where it's going with the transhuman movement and the big egos and everybody trying to live forever. And I feel like they haven't really grappled with the existential part that's really important, because if you don't deal with that piece, then we're just creating more of a mess and we might not actually evolve at all. But what do you think of that?
Oh, wow. So, yeah, God, who knows, right? There's so much to say in all of that. But if I had to say something, so if correct me if I'm wrong, but so I think there are a lot of different threads to follow in what you just said. So yeah, we definitely seem to be at a moment in history where all of these technological advances are kind of constantly pushing us into new directions that, at least for me, and so a lot of what I teach currently is like ethics and life sciences and stuff like that. So they throw us into all these new ethical dilemmas, whether you're talking about transhumanism or advances in AI or synthetic biology. I mean, whatever is happening on a myriad of fronts that way. They're forcing us to think about all sorts of new things. So one thing you definitely can ask that I think is really interesting and insightful to ask, and I think what you were just suggesting is that, my God, shouldn't we stop for a minute and kind of evaluate whether or not these are things that we want to be doing, and like, what does this actually bring to the table, right? I mean, so one way that I tend to like to frame this or think about it is, I mean, here we are sitting in the 21st century with, just unbelievable technological resources at our fingertips. But I can meaningfully say, I mean, is my life or your life any fundamentally happier or better, or is it a better human life than, the life that Aristotle or Plato or Zhuangzi had, several millennia ago? And you can meaningfully say that perhaps it's fundamentally not any necessarily better or worse than, what human life looked like a long time ago. So what has all this technological process or progress really gotten us? So you can definitely ask that. Another question that I think you can interestingly ask, that I think is also what you were perhaps just hinting at, is that perhaps a failing of science, contemporary science, is the lack of consideration or thought about the direction that it goes. So oftentimes I think you might, in a very, very general characterization, say that scientists just follow whatever source of progress they can to whatever end it might lead, right? So very stark example of something like that would be the invention of the atomic bomb or something like that, right? We realize we have this technological capacity and we create it before, of course, the scientists that did that were grappling with the fallout that all of it would have, but they go ahead and do it anyways, and we're all left with the fallout of, now having atomic weapons and so on and so forth. So you can meaningfully ask, what responsibility do scientists have in the creation of all these technological advances? And so there is a whole area in philosophy of science called kind of values in science that ask questions just like this, or kind of considers what values scientists bring to the table in the creation of all this sort of stuff. And I think those are really interesting, fascinating questions that deserve far more attention than I think actually a lot of scientists and future scientists, people that are aiming to go into the sciences, would be well served kind of giving more explicit attention to all this and not just letting it be a background concern. And there is this unfortunate push to kind of publish or make progress regardless of what the consequences might be, oftentimes in the scientific community. So more reflection on that would be great. And then correct me if I'm wrong, or if I miss anything that you were getting at, or if I'm mischaracterizing it. But I think that there is definitely a piece in all this that I think does have to do with kind of the epistemic values. So there is then also the piece of science and kind of what we can discover empirically about the world that is just interesting because it's interesting, right? I mean, cosmology isn't necessarily going to, I mean, it could lead to some great technological advancement, but right now, thinking about how many universes there are and evidence for and against universes is probably not like going to necessarily, give me the next app on my iPhone, but it is a super interesting question, right? That I could attach a lot of value to and is something worth investigating. Why? Because perhaps what part of what it is to lead a good human life is to, think and wonder about that stuff and get inch closer to truth when it comes to some of it. So yeah, it's worth studying cosmology to really understand what the cosmos is and what it couldn't be, or what could exist beyond it, if that's even a coherent question to ask.
Yeah, no, I think it's a beautiful question, and all of science should be about exploring the truth about the nature of reality and continuing to do so. And sometimes it gets frustrating when you start to see that the centralized model has been somewhat captured by incentives, and then you start to see the misdirection of incentives driving certain research or certain subjects and then not funding other subjects. And so that's an interesting subject of its own. And I'm sure from the inside, I'm looking at it from the outside, but you're within the structure, even in school systems. And I'm sure it can be frustrating to some degree, but also exciting that we can even explore all these things with all the tools that we have and have funding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, very much a very clear example of values in science and how it's very hard, if not like a question of whether or not science is even something that can be value free or purely objective, comes from precisely questions like that, right? We always do have to choose what we want to fund and where our resources want to go and what we want to study, right? And you can have those debates, but it's never going to be perfectly objective, right? There's a case to be made for studying more cosmology, and then there's a case for saying, well, all that funding that goes to cosmologies really would be better serving, more cancer research or something, right? So that's a real debate to have, but it's not going to be objective. Values play a part or play a role in all of that.
Yeah. If you had unlimited funding, just you yourself, what would you do with your attention and time? Where would you start focusing your energy more if you didn't have to pay bills?
Oh my gosh, great question. And can you make it happen for me?
Hey, you never know.
No. Gosh, I mean, being philosopher first and foremost, I'm kind of, I guess, cheap to have on the payroll, right? Like I've been in labs and I'm technically part of a lab, but my lab is all theory. So for better or for worse, what I do is I read the hard work of other people that are actually collecting empirical evidence and looking at it. And then I kind of sit back and think about what falls out from that, what the consequences are, which means that to fund me, just like give me enough to, have a bit of food and put a house over my head and, my kid too, maybe. And that's really all it costs to answer most of the questions that I want to answer. I suppose enough library books and journal subscriptions too. But so I guess folks like me are relatively cheap compared to, say, somebody that needs a telescope to really, explore what they need to explore, want to explore. So I guess what I would say is keep giving the funding to the people that do the real work out there, because I rely on them hugely to be able to do what I do. But then, make sure you fund a few people like me here and there, because, now and again, having some people that just sit back and think at a computer and kind of have the space and room to be able to analyze and be what I would call the gadfly in Socratic terms, right? Be the dissenter, be the critical person on the wall. Occasionally, we do say something helpful. So a little bit of funding for folks like me, I think, is a good thing too. But no, and
Awesome.
the big world of having millions or billions of dollars to dole out, I would say give it to people like Mike Levin and Mike Wong. They're the ones that need the money more than I do, and are doing the interesting work.
Yeah. And on a daily basis, what does your life somewhat consist of? I know you're a professor, right?
So I mostly teach. But I do some research on the side, so I get to talk to people like you about stuff like this, which is great. So just the fact that I have a life where I'm able to do anything like even remotely in this realm is fantastic. I spend a lot of time in front of a classroom and interacting with students, and then I have some great collaborators. I'm really, really fortunate and am so lucky to be able to talk with people like Dan McShay and just a whole host of folks, some of the people that you've named here, and get to interact with them and kind of bounce ideas off them, and just have their ear to kind of give them feedback, get feedback from them, and be in a position where I'm able to do that and kind of direct my attention towards being able to think, what is natural selection? What are the ingredients? How does a selective process actually work? And what do you need for that to actually happen, right? And stuff like that. So I get to spend, what does that amount to in a real world case? It's me sitting on my couch next to my dog, reading weird philosophy and weird biology, and then sitting back and thinking about it when I go for a run or a walk or something. That's what it
so
looks
cool.
like in the day-to-day.
I love hearing how people's day-to-day is, because it's like you can really live a good life as a philosopher and a teacher, and it's so cool to be able to be around, like you said, these folks. Dan McShay, is that his name? I listened to him speak with Michael Levin. I think you were even on that podcast, and it's even cool to me that I can, in Arizona, be talking to a guy all the way across the world, and then I can also be listening to podcasts while driving and doing laundry. And so I just think access to information and knowledge is just so fun.
Oh my God,
in this day and age.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I just absolutely love the fact that I have at my fingertip whatever podcasts of just so many brilliant people doing so much great stuff out there, and just getting to read the latest science journalism, and just there's so much fascinating stuff going on right now. And of course at the same time there's a lot of junk out there too, so you have to be really careful in what you sift through and make sure that what you're accessing is good legitimate stuff. But just the fact that you can sit down and do that is astounding to me, and just amazing.
Is there anything you're chomping on right now, or really it's on your mind all the time that you're trying to write about and you just want to hash these ideas out?
Oh gosh, yeah, I bounce around all sorts of stuff. So boy, one kind of a more pop piece or idea for a pop piece that would be for a more general audience. Something that I've been toying around with writing that I find interesting. And this comes from actually some of the conversations perhaps you've listened to that I've had with folks like Mark Solms or Mike Levin, are things like how we think about fitness, and how that might have given a rise to something like consciousness. And so I suppose the elevator pitch for this is something like, we tend to think of enhanced fitness, so classic survival of the fittest, which of course wasn't actually Darwin who said that, it was Spencer. But survival of the fittest, but what do you mean by fitness? So there's a whole realm of philosophy of biology that thinks about what fitness is. So you might say that one person is fitter than another from an evolutionary perspective. But what does that actually mean, right? You could maybe point at something like how many kids I have versus how many kids you have, so number of offspring, right? But that's weird because one of us could have more offspring than the other in the future, but right, how do you cash that out? Now we're just talking about weird kind of contingent future possibilities. So measuring something like fitness, you tend to do at a population level, but it's actually hard to attribute to an individual. Yet, if we say that like being the fittest individual that we can be from an evolutionary perspective is the goal, right? So here we are back to goal-directedness of life or of natural processes. What does that even mean? So to me, I actually think that one immediate way in which people often go wrong with this, whether you're just talking about kind of a guy on the street thinking about, survival of the fittest, to actually really technical questions about what fitness means when you're measuring it in a population as a population geneticist or something like that, is that I think that there's frequently a mistake in that we take fitness to be one thing when in fact it's two things that often conflict with each other. So fitness is really, right, number of offspring, so reproduction, but it's also persistence, survival. So, and in nature, or in biology, those things tend to actually conflict with each other, right? I can have more offspring, but oftentimes it's going to come at the expense of shorter lifespan, or I can live longer, but it's often going to come at the expense of having fewer offspring. So if those are aims that say are the result of something like natural selection, and the fact that they come into conflict so frequently, seldom do they actually align, I think. Now, as a single organism or as a single thing, you're faced with a choice. So, which do you pursue, right? And that, to me, would be the beginning of consciousness or agency. That forced choice, now you have to choose a thing and go a direction. And that's what's kind of interesting, that you don't maybe get, a rock doesn't get that choice. It doesn't have meaningful fitness in that way. Or if it does, it's only the persisting form. It's not the reproducing form that would put it into conflict, which is where you see meaningful agency come up. So as a pop piece, I'm thinking about writing about how fitness and this kind of fundamental conflict, that it's really two aims, not just the one, is actually maybe kind of the root seed of where consciousness comes from.
That's very interesting. So what did you end up choosing for your personal life?
Oh, God, right. I think it's a conflict every time you take a goal-directed action. You're kind of going for one or the other, whether you're aware of it or not.
Okay, but not having that many offspring.
Yeah. No, well, I suppose in one way, what I'd want to say is something to the effect of choosing not to have offspring doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything against nature or, somehow fundamentally not fit or something to that effect, which I think is what the direction some people would want to read it. If you take a really extreme, like, bro view of what it means to, be the alpha male or something, going out having a bunch of offspring, and you're like, oh God, you're just such a dumb version of what fitness is. There's really very little real backing behind any of it. So
that's good to clarify, because you never know. This could be snipped out and someone could go to the
right.
sperm bank and just, you've heard the weird stories. So with all your students, do you mind sharing some of the key features of what it is that you share with them that would help them to think better? Like, what do you try to share with them that you wish you would have known when you were younger?
Oh, God. Well, the one thing that I tend to try to leave off most classes I teach with would be that ultimately critical thinking, I think, is absolutely essential. And, what I try to do through my pedagogy and through my teaching is really to instill the virtue, you might say, of critical thinking in students, and that most fundamentally, I try to leave students with a little kind of riddle or paradox, which is, I say, hey, here's the message, right? My message is, if you've taken this class and you've listened to me, take what I say and evaluate it critically. Anything that you've heard in this class, apply a degree of scrutiny to. And that goes for anything that you've read in this class or any other scholar that we've interacted with their thoughts or their ideas. Read it or engage with it critically and make your own assertion or come to your own conclusion as to whether or not you should accept it or not, using, good reasoning skills, right? No, not just your opinion. I can, my opinion, whether chocolate or vanilla is better or worse, is purely subjective, but you actually have reasons to think why what I say or I don't say might be valid or invalid. And then I offer that to them, and then I say, and this, of course, includes what I'm telling you right now, right? Don't just take me for, don't just take me at face value here, evaluate whether or not you should take seriously the claim that I'm making, right? Come to your own conclusion as to whether or not you should evaluate everything critically. So yeah, I'd say that if I try to instill one thing in my students, the most general level, it's bring that sort of critical thought to anything that you encounter, whether in the university or in life generally, including what I'm saying right now.
That's awesome. Those are good points for sure. And I'm curious, in the next 5 to 10 years, what are you seeing as the biggest things that you're excited about and also concerned about, if anything?
Excited about? If we continue to get funding for scientific research and universities, which unfortunately is under kind of a lot of threat right now. We're just on the cusp of learning so much cool stuff. Just things like the Webb telescope coming online. And it's unreal. It's so cool to be alive at this moment. And, my kid is going to know stuff that I'll probably never get a chance to know. And it's so awesome, right? So to be alive at this moment in time where we have access to kind of the scientific tools and knowledge and work that so many people are doing is just so cool. And again, I could rattle off so many things on those fronts that are just absolutely fascinating. By the same token, I do think that it's also there are problems in that with the kind of advent of sharing of information, particularly in ways that don't have that kind of rigor of critical thinking and analysis and review, we are at a real disinformation is plaguing so many things. I think our democratic institutions and just our ability to retain a lot of our own cognitive resources. So I do see that as probably the next large existential threat to us as individuals and to humanity in many ways. So yeah, that's very scary, and I think the moment that people alive now and future generations are going to have to overcome and grapple with, to say nothing of things like climate change and whatnot, where you really hope that the science is taken seriously and we can start really changing our trajectory from where we're at now. I think that is our generation is going to be judged on the progress we make on those fronts.
Yeah. And then being able to sort through information right now, like you said, and find truthful narratives. What do you think about the problems of the opposite, which is also censorship?
Yeah, so the question of free speech and how do you censor and kind of the marketplace of ideas and stuff like that is, I mean, that's the trick, right? That's the dilemma that I think we today as a society and as a global community are very much facing. Where I stand on that depends on the day you're asking me, right? Like what I can say is that I think maybe two representatives of each of those positions are probably best cashed out, are best encapsulated by John Stuart Mill and Plato. And I attribute this to the guy's name is a great Jason Stanley, philosopher at, I believe, Yale, though I think he just went to Toronto. He's written a number of great books, but one's on propaganda, and he kind of highlights the tension between those two, where John Stuart Mill very much advocates for the marketplace of ideas and full-fleshed freedom of speech, kind of under the principle that if you suppress ideas, right, then you don't have to come up with good arguments against them, right? So if you forbid all the flat earthers from speaking out, then you and I are never confronted with flat earthers and have to actually remember reasons why the planet is in fact round and not flat, which actually is a great exercise, right? I challenge students to do this all the time. I pretend to be a flat earther and I say, okay, ad hoc, right here, right now, room full of undergraduates, prove to me that the earth is not flat. And actually, a lot of them, it takes them a minute to like remember enough science to be able to verify that the Earth isn't flat, right? So you actually have to kind of remember how we have day and night and the tilt of the Earth and how all that works in the solar system. And like, yeah, when you remember enough of that, then you can actually put me on my heels. But for a while, I'll have them on their heels in trying to prove that the Earth isn't flat when I start citing a bunch of evidence that it is. So John Stuart Mill would say, right, that it's really important to let the flat earthers say what they want to say, not because it's true, but because it forces everybody to actually recite the arguments and remember why the Earth really is in fact round. You actually have to know why that's the case. So it's good to have some flat earthers to force all of us to remember the truth. But on the flip side, Plato has a dimmer view of humanity, I think, and Plato unfortunately thinks that the hoi polloi, the many, unfortunately are too predisposed to being swayed by charisma and demagogues and stuff like that. And Plato thinks that actually being able to kind of recite what John Stuart Mill would hope all of us would be able to do, kind of working your way methodically to truth, Plato, I think, thinks that unfortunately most people are probably not that capable of, and therefore you really do need a more paternalistic society where some people, or Plato imagines philosophers, who have access to the truth actually kind of have to dictate or paternalistically things for other people and put certain things off limits. And that's the only way that you're going to get the ideal society. So yeah, certain days I think, my God, we need the marketplace of ideas and we can't suppress things. And then other days I look around and I go, oh my God, this is travesty, right? We're never going to be able to... I have dim views of humanity. So it depends on the day you ask me.
Yeah, we're a very immature species with a lot of self-importance and lack of humility. So it's like a weird paradox to consider, because you can't really trust crowds, and you can't really see. I don't know. Do you see us making it? I was wondering. I'm not a doom and gloom guy because I'm grateful that I'm here. But like you said, sometimes you're like, I don't know about this. Maybe we're not going to make it, but it's not up to me anyway.
Yeah.
I always ask people, I've had you for an hour, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world if this was the last time you could speak to them?
Oh my gosh. Last time I could speak. That's a good end of interview question. I haven't run across that one before. Nice. I like it. Boy, if I could I would say, don't listen to anything I have to say. Go out and read some Plato.
Plato, start there, huh?
There.
That's one of your favorite places to begin.
Yeah, read Plato. Don't listen to anything I have to say.
Awesome. Well, that's good. Good answer. I think people could always benefit from reading some Plato. So I appreciate your time today. Is there anything else you want to share, or any websites or links you want people to find you at?
No, I mean, luckily I have one of those names that I think is pretty easily Googleable. So I'm sure most people who are interested can track down my stuff pretty easily. But no, thanks for your time. I appreciate people like you who are kind of listening to us weird academics and the strange things we have to say. So thanks for having me on, and it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Grateful for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.